Welcome, everyone. My name is Alex Benkenstein. I head up the Natural Resource Governance Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. And as I said, first off, just a welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a lovely group of speakers and participants. Today's event is co-hosted by the South African Institute of International Affairs. I'll refer to it by our acronym SIA. And you'll also hear from, in a minute, from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Rica. Just briefly, let's quickly get through the etiquette. When not speaking, obviously, please do mute your mic. Also, do inactivate your video just to improve the bandwidth. And just to let everyone know that we are live streaming this event. Then a few quick words from my side on the South African Institute of International Affairs. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are an African think tank based in South Africa, but doing work across the region on a range of policy issues, everything from traditional foreign policy concerns to natural resource governance, climate change, trade policy, economic integration, and so forth. And as I said, we work at a national level in South Africa, but also participate, obviously, with local partners in national policy debates throughout the Africa region. And then we engage with regional institutions, SADC, African Union, and so forth, and also participate in global processes, whether those might be related to trade, climate change, and so forth. A few words on the climate change work. There's a long history of policy engagement, supporting policy dialogue, research activities around the areas of climate change, green economy, and just transition. I would invite everyone who hasn't yet visited the SIA website to please do so and engage with the material there. It is almost everything we produce is available for free download. It is a wonderful resource. And then, of course, you're able to access the contact details of all our experts through the website. This event today is part of a series of engagements and activities by the Institute on climate-related themes in the run-up to COP26. And there will be activities around climate finance, just transition, NDCs, and so forth. And that might take the form of dialogues such as this one, written publications, policy briefings, and so forth. So do please keep an eye out for that and reach out to us. There is some wonderful content coming through soon. At this stage, I'm going to hand over to Rica from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. After he said a few words, I will return to just a quick review of the agenda and a bit more context on this event and what follows it. Eric, over to you.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Alex, for the brief introduction of this. I'm also very happy to join in this discussion so that we see how we move on. So my name is Rica, working with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, based here in Nairobi, Kenya, under the regional program, Energy Security and Climate Change in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a program looking into issues around climate change, energy security, renewable energy, all those very important elements around addressing climate change in the wider Sub-Saharan Africa. And we are really very happy that you've managed to join in this session, because really, as already indicated by Alex, this is one of very important kind of very, very interesting platforms that we are having, so that we can see what kind of direction are we taking, where are we with the discussion and actions around climate change, especially in the context of the NDCs ahead of the COP26 later in the year. So it becomes very important that we can create these kind of platforms just to see what kind of ambitions, where are we with this kind of climate ambitions, where are we in terms of climate actions, how can we cross-learn from different actions at different country levels, and what kind of experiences can we pick from different actions within the context of NDCs, and where the opportunities, where the gaps that we can learn from. So this is I think a very interesting opportunity that we can share experiences, and we can also get to what do we want to see going forward into the COP and moving into the actions or implementation of NDCs in the region, and particularly in the SADC region in this regard. So we are always very happy as CAS, this regional program, always very happy to engage in this kind of discussions. We always support kind of technical work, policy actions, and this kind of platforms that enable people to learn and share. I won't speak so much because we want to see what kind of presentations and what we can pick from that. I want to just give it back to Alex so that we get guided on what happens next. But thank you very everybody for being here, and I'm really looking forward to very rich discussions and probably some kind of outputs that we can pick from this. So thanks so much, and back to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Eric. So quickly from my side, just in terms of the event itself, as you see framed in terms of strengthening the NDCs, specifically in the Southern African region, we know the NDCs are really at the core of global level action in terms of the Paris Agreement, but also in terms of a shared agreement on climate action at the national level. So these are central documents and need to be guided by those principles of inclusiveness, comprehensiveness, and also ambition. Obviously, we understand that the NDC process has been impacted by COVID, and that has meant that some of the NDCs are not yet submitted. So we're in an interesting space here. We have some NDC submitted, some still undergoing consultation and finalization. We thought this is a good opportunity to draw on good practice, not only from the SADC region, but from beyond. So you'll see we have a speaker from South Africa, a speaker from Rwanda, and a speaker from Costa Rica. I'll give you more details on the speakers just before they actually take the floor. But the idea is also that we're not necessarily, by presenting these particular countries, saying that this is absolutely best practice. We recognize that there is good practice emerging across a variety of settings. And almost any NDC process, there are some good practice lessons that can be drawn from. So we want to draw on that as a starting point for dialogue, starting point for discussion, in order to inform NDC processes, primarily in the Southern African region. Also recognizing that, this is pretty much an ongoing process. Even for those countries who have already submitted, 5 years down the line, there's a new submission deadline. So even for those countries, there's an opportunity to draw on the lessons and integrate those insights into national processes and practice. So very quickly, in terms of our structure, we're going to have a short scene setting remarks by our climate lead, Romy Chevalier. We're then going to move on directly to our 3 national case studies, if you will, starting with South Africa, then on to Costa Rica, and ending with Rwanda. We're not going to take questions after each speaker. We will then, at the end of all the speakers, lead into a Q&A session. To the speakers, I would caution you that I'm going to be quite strict on time, because I do think that we have to allow enough time to have some engagement in Q&A. To the participants, you are welcome to insert your questions in the chat function. And then, of course, you can also raise your hand once we enter into the Q&A phase of proceedings. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Romy Chevalier.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to screen share. Alex, all good in terms of my screen share? 1 second. Hi, thanks so much, Alex, for the intro, and welcome participants. Thank you so much for joining and taking the time out of your schedules to attend this meeting. What I'm going to attempt to do in 10 minutes, and it's quite a task, is to give you a kind of a scene setting presentation on what NDCs are seeking to achieve, where we at globally in terms of the status of revised NDCs, then look specifically at the region, at the 16 countries of the SADC region, and look at where they are, and then discuss briefly some of the opportunities around developing robust and inclusive NDCs and what this can mean for our countries going forward, and then just some key content and process options in terms of lesson sharing. As Alex said, as countries revise and strengthen their NDCs, there's a lot that we can learn from countries in the region, countries on the continent, and countries globally. So just in terms of just to set the scene, we're all aware of the Paris Agreement, and we know that in 2015, 195 countries plus signed onto this global agreement, which essentially set us on a common trajectory, pathways, long-term visions on how we are going to address issues related to climate change. There were goals on mitigation, looking at reducing temperature targets to well below 2 degrees, but hopefully below 1.5 degrees. And there were adaptation targets, which look to enhance the adaptive capacity of our countries and to strengthen resilience. So in order to achieve these two targets, global goal on mitigation and adaptation, essentially there were tools and instruments that were envisaged to set our countries on the right path. And one of these, and there are a variety of them, is the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And the other, which we won't talk about today, but there will be future conversations with Thayo about this, is around the long-term strategies. And essentially what is important to remember in the background of this conversation to date is that we're looking to achieve a 1.5 degree temperature target under the Paris Agreement. And if you look at the graph that I've put on there, essentially the trajectories are showing that we are already at a 1.1 degree temperature target as in 2020, which means that essentially we are running out of time, and that global ambition towards temperature targets and resilience building is essential and urgent. You would have seen recently the IPCC new assessment report, the 6th assessment report coming out. Again, they call it Code Red for Humanity, essentially showing that climate change is more urgent and more widespread and intensifying, and essentially that actions are urgent. Specifically for Africa, which we know is the continent most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we know that the NDCs of all countries are therefore essential in making sure that we're reducing the requisite global emissions and building our societies towards resilient structures. So we come to the tool, the NDC tool, and again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating this, but just to get everybody on the same page, essentially what they seek to achieve, it's a roadmap, a national roadmap to 2030. And as the name suggests, nationally determined, they are self-determined plans. So our countries have set out our plans and our action points to reduce global emissions and enhance resilience for the until 2030. And these are articulated and reviewed every 5 years, as Alex mentioned. So in 2015 was the first iteration of these NDCs. 2020 now and 2021 is the second iteration. And so the review process goes forward. So every 5 to 10 years, these NDCs are reviewed. And essentially they are living documents. So they are there to show increasing ambition. So the idea is that countries demonstrate increasing ambition, and then there's a whole process around global stocktake, which I won't go into now, but essentially it's looking at the NDCs globally and making sure that cumulatively they're reaching the temperature targets that are envisaged. And obviously there's a lot of politics around countries how much they should, their historical contributions versus their current emissions and how much they should contribute to this collective goal. But essentially, these are self-determined plans, so countries should be as ambitious as possible, taking their own national context into account. These NDCs are also the building blocks for longer-term futures. So all our countries are developing these long-term low-emission goals at the moment to 2050. And essentially, these NDCs are the iterative targets, the 5-year targets towards building the 2050 future. So they set us on a path towards a longer-term vision. So essentially, they're really important stepping stones towards achieving longer-term goals. They take what all the policies and existing framework into account. So they're not starting entirely from scratch, but essentially they're a comprehensive framework of all the existing policies and budgetary frameworks that exist at a national level. And they also look at regional frameworks, the SDG targets, and everything else that our countries have already committed to, and take these into account. And just to reiterate, these are all of society approach. So essentially, they look at all the sectors that are contributing to climate change. And the idea is to create sectoral targets, stakeholder action plans to move us in the right direction. I just wanted to show you this. It's just, if you can imagine that this is the NDCs, you'll see on the blue image is the climate specific target. So in our country, we have an array of global of climate policies, adaptation policies, climate bills, sectoral targets. The NDCs seek to kind of put this all together in a comprehensive or holistic way. And then they also take account of our development plans and targets. So our green growth plans, our post-COVID recovery plans. The idea is that they take account of existing national documentation. But as you can see, they also refer to the AU's agenda, so continental targets, global targets, et cetera, and they are meant to all be aligned and integrated. So globally, and this is just, I've taken this diagram from the Climate Targets Update Tracker, which is online and available. But essentially, this is a snapshot into where the globe is in terms of their emissions, their NDCs development. So in 2015, there were 192 countries that submitted their first NDCs. And as of 2020, 2021, you'll see that countries are in the process, as Alex mentioned, of submitting their revised or second NDC. And there has been delays due to the COVID situation, but essentially the UNFCCC has requested countries to ensure that their NDCs, their second and revised NDCs, are ready for COP26, so that we have a good idea of globally where we sit. So to date, 85 countries, including the 27 EU bloc, have submitted a new and updated NDC, and 73 countries have not updated their targets. And this was taken from a snapshot on the 6th of September. And you can see in terms of countries, I just tried to illustrate with colors here, but the darker blue countries have strong, according to the CAT website, have submitted stronger NDC targets. So we're looking at countries like Canada, the US, UK, Morocco, Costa Rica, Norway, having submitted stronger NDC targets. There are then also countries that have submitted their revised NDCs, but that have not increased ambition. And according to this CAT website and their analysis done, countries like Australia, Brazil, Russia, Mexico have not increased their ambition in their second iteration of the NDC. And then you've got countries like the likes of South Africa, Nigeria, and China, who have stronger NDCs in the pipeline. They're going through due process in country at the moment to be kind of legislated and enacted, but that have been proposed. And you can see the lighter green countries, China, for example, South Africa, that have proposed stronger targets, but it isn't in legislation yet. But essentially what this also shows is that the NDCs to date do not meet the temperature targets that we are looking to achieve under the Paris Agreement, and they collectively still exceed 2.6 degrees target. So it's 80% chance of exceeding our 2-degree target, and much greater chance of exceeding our 1.5 degree target. In SADC, you'll see here the little red buttons show which countries have actually submitted their revised NDC. So this is formally on the UNFCCC website. There's an NDC registry, and it essentially says when the first NDC was registered, and then the second, and what date that was revised. And you'll see the likes of Namibia, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, and the Seychelles have submitted a revised NDC document. But as I mentioned, countries like South Africa, which we'll hear from later, are in the process of the stakeholder engagement, the revision process, enacting it, et cetera, et cetera. So there are revised NDCs that are in the pipeline. So just in terms of lesson sharing and best practice, because of the fact that NDCs need to be revised and strengthened every 5 to 10 years, this allows us the space to look at what other countries are doing and essentially base some of the content and process examples. We can kind of incorporate them into our new NDC targets and revision processes. So, for example, I've done some analysis personally on some of the content of some of the NDCs, and they vary. The ones in SADC vary by ambition, by targets, by level of detail. Some countries build on existing framework, others don't. So in terms of integration, they're different. And obviously priority areas differ, with a lot of emphasis actually on mitigation. And so for Africa, obviously the priority is adaptation and resilience building. So there's a lot of work that can be done on increasing the content around adaptation processes. In some NDCs in the country, there's no explicit mention of gender or youth. In some countries, for example, where there's a focus on agriculture, there's no explicit mention of farmers or female farmers. So all of this content can be improved in the next iteration. Some countries have neglected to put in an implementation matrix, or it lacks detail, or it lacks a budget or an M&E system. So these are all parts of content that could be strengthened. And then it's very important that countries are explicit about the means of support that they need to implement their plans. And so a country like Rwanda, we'll hear from later, they've put conditional and unconditional targets in place in terms of what's needed as per their financial requirements to implement their plans. And then we look at some of the processes. So in putting an NDC together, what are the kind of best practice or good practice processes that need to be in place that other countries can take into account? So how do countries integrate evidence into their update evidence? We know that every 5 years evidence changes. So how are we ensuring that we've got the latest evidence, both scientific and local and indigenous knowledge is incorporated into our NDCs? How are countries looking at this holistic systems approach? What structures have they put in place in terms of coordination and harmonization? And I think we'll hear from South Africa at the very high level in terms of the Presidential Climate Commission, some of the tools that are in place to ensure dialogue, coordination, and communication across different levels of government, across different sectors of society. Obviously, processes, which South Africa will talk to next, is about stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders, varying stakeholders and non-governmental stakeholders should be included through the life cycle of an NDC, right from the design through to the prioritization setting, agenda setting, all the way through implementation and monitoring and accountability. So how can countries learn to be more thorough and inclusive in the engagement approach? Costa Rica is going to speak in a presentation which was really interesting. They've used foresight and futures thinking in the way that they've approached how they're going to deal with their future trajectories on climate change. They've used scenarios and visioning processes and methods to kind of envisage a future and then think about what they need to do now to get there. So Costa Rica will speak to that. Leadership, obviously a key component of an ambitious climate agenda. Who's doing what in terms of leadership and high level thinking? How are countries creating awareness around the NDCs and outreach approaches? And how are we including civil society and other groups in the accountability and tracking mechanisms? Because often these NDCs are kind of paper promises and are often not actually actioned. But this is okay. Last slide is what we actually can get from a thorough, robust, inclusive, comprehensive, transparent NDC. It can catalyze transformation across the region. Yeah.
You'll just have to move through this quite quickly.
Yeah,
thanks.
Perfect. So essentially, these are the things, if you do them properly, the things or the types of change that can be catalyzed. So obviously we would contribute to a collective effort in terms of what's required by science under the Paris Agreement. The review process, obviously, as I mentioned, incorporate best practice, new science and updates. It's a countrywide vision. It gets everybody on the same path. It shows which priority sectors are being focused on, what investment is needed. and essentially can get everybody on board. It's an entry point for basically all interventions. And importantly here is it's an opportunity to redress power imbalances, structural and systemic inequalities that have existed through the inclusive decision-making processes, stakeholder processes, etc. And obviously it's the opportunity to show action. So that's why implementation is so important around these processes. And they also provide the opportunity to protect the environment and the natural resource base on which we all depend. Right, thank you very much, Alex, for the time. Sorry I went over, and look forward to the other presentations to follow.
Excellent, thanks so much. Without any commentary from my side, I'm going to hand over directly to our presenter from South Africa. We're going to be hearing from Mr. Mkhuthazi Stileke. He's the Director of International Climate Change at the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries in South Africa. Mr. Stileke, you're welcome to proceed. You might still be muted.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you and we see your presentation.
You can hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and the introductions, and greetings to Romy and yourself, Alex, but to the audience, widely. Thank you for the opportunity. My cut here today is, I'm trying to page the slide, but it's not moving. Okay. Sorry, I'm having a slight problem. I'm trying to page the slides through, but it seems I'm not able to do that.
Perhaps just by the arrows on your keyboard. Sometimes that works better than the mouse.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing, but
okay, well, let's not be held up too much by this.
Okay, that's fine. Let me try, and because I think it's good that can you see it now?
No, it's not uploaded yet.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Okay, it's coming up now. You can maybe
let me just check if. Yeah. Now, when I project a slide on slideshow, it's when I lose the functionality to use the arrows down.
That's all right. This is better than nothing. You can maybe just enlarge
okay.
somewhat.
Yeah, let me do that. Thanks for that. Okay, I'll start off with the brief that I was given. Indeed, South Africa is now nearing the final stages of the stakeholder, consultations, which it started during the first half of the year. But even prior to that, there are other steps that I will try and elaborate on. But the brief that we were given through Romy was that we need to share a best practice on processes that we followed, but also lessons learned that we could share. Secondly, to also touch on what lessons from South Africa's engagement process with different stakeholders, right from the outset of the starting of the draft, the revised, NDC, till development, stage, all the way to implementation. Yes, we're not there yet on implementation, but we are able to share all these other stages. But also references may be made in relation to how we went about the development of the first NDC. The stakeholder consultations in our case were covered across 9 provinces that we are having in South Africa. We have 9 provinces, and we made it a point that in line with the expectations as impressed in our constitution and policies, that all stakeholders, are consulted, across sectors. and in some provinces, this was also supported at political, level through the MECs. The political principals for departments within provinces are called MECs in our case, and we made sure that they are involved in this. The stakeholders comprised of participants from various representations and formations, including government, NGOs, civil society, business, etc., because they would prefer to impress, certain aspects that are priority to them, and all these competing, views and expectations, we need to try and, sort of balance and navigate our way towards what will be, owned by all parties across. So in the spirit of inclusivity as well, because the context and the setting we operated in was that of COVID-19, and hence we had to try and be innovative in terms of making sure that there are those participants who would physically be able to pitch in the sessions that we conducted, but those would also interface virtually. There were various interest groups as enlisted there. One of the key lessons is that it's important that a party or a country, embarks, on a research, exercise, so that whatever target or NDC, targets and objectives, are arrived at the end are the targets that are better informed. But so research is foundational in this regard. So research, its importance is that it enables you to trigger input from stakeholders, because when you consult, you must at least, table something that will elicit, different views, from the diverse stakeholders that we mentioned earlier. And the approach, as you do that, is key in that the approach must not be that you are in defense necessarily of what you have drafted, as the officials or the research that you commissioned, but you would rather want to stakeholders, to air their views and thoughts, which will enable you to get, more input. It's important as well to get on board credible entities or institutions that are familiar with the scope of climate change and the nature and the arena of climate negotiations. In our case, we brought on board entities who have been party to these negotiations, as well as climate change work. We used the University of Cape Town Energy Research Center, but also the Center for Industrial and Scientific, research. But at the policy, from the policy perspective, it's also key that you provide guidance, because some of these entities are more technical in their orientation. So it's important that from the government side, the relevant guidance be given in terms of, aspects such as policy imperatives, as well as government priorities. It's also key that this has implications, for economic growth, both in terms of stimulating it, but at the same time, making sure that the key sectors that will carry the responsibility of implementing this are not, compromised by putting, targets that are not realistic and so forth and so on. And the context of this exercise is also key in the sense that the NDC should enable us to contribute towards economic recovery, both from the perspective as rooted from COVID, but even prior to COVID, as South Africa, we had challenges, in terms of economic growth, in which our economy had been, declining in terms of the GDP, indicators and various others. So the NDP is conceived, in the light that it should enable us, to make a positive difference in terms of these challenges. It's also important that from the government side, that you are closer to the team that works on the modeling aspects, And what is key there, you want to impress of the priority assumptions that need to be considered, which assumptions are also partly aligned to some of the key policies like your national development plans, at a macro level, but also the relevant technologies that may have to be taken on board, that modeling exercise, as well as policies, especially energy policies, because in terms of our emission structure, the energy is responsible for the significant proportion of emissions. So you want, the alignment in terms of what energy, policy targets are built, into the model or are used as an input to run the model that will enable, for instance, a mitigation target. And you want here to sustain policy consistency, so to speak, or to be as close as possible to policy consistency. You don't want to create a situation in which there's inconsistencies, in policies that are in different sectors. You want better coordination, at least including in this regard. So the guiding of the research work to balance interpretational aspects following from already agreed aspects on NDC negotiations is key. So these experts from these entities must be able to have a better understanding of how to interpret, what it means of the 5-yearly, cycles of the NDC, and what sort of realistic targets, can be met within, those 5-yearly, cycles. The domestic socioeconomics, the science basis aspects are some of the key considerations. The other lesson here is that it's important to get political, buy-in and support. For instance, in our case, what we mean by that is that following the approval by cabinet to embark on stakeholder consultations using the draft updated NDC as a basis, our Minister Barbara Creasy then launched the draft updated NDC, which then unfolded stakeholder consultation. I indicated that we started during the first half of the year, but the political, buy-in extends to such aspects as having to include even when you embark to include the MECs, for instance, because they have a better pool, they have better convening powers, within those provinces. You make use of the heads of departments, the directors, generals, their political principals, and they have a pool in that regard. You want to put them in the program, but not only limited thereto, but also including in planning stages, of the process, including such aspects as the dates that may be common, the speakers that they may identify, the kind of experiences they may share. You don't want, when you get, an audience, you only talk of the NDC. You want relationships that extends to the experiences and some of the flagship initiatives that are implemented at province level, so that they can relate what you are coming with that which they are working on in terms of climate change and the broader environmental agenda, aspects. Steer towards government speaking in one voice. We have an institutionalized climate, structures in government, in our case, in the guise of Intergovernmental Committee on Climate Change, the National Climate Change, committee, which comprises, including of stakeholders outside of government, the NCCC, so to speak. And then recently, at the beginning of the year, we had the launch of the Presidential Climate Commission. So it's key that you must have shared all the draft prior, engaging other stakeholders, and see if you can be able to share views, share common understanding of what some of these targets mean. I think that's very, important. It's important as well to also know your institutional structure in government. For instance, in our case, we have what is referred to as the International Climate, International Cooperation on Trade and Security. It's the ICTS cluster, where following consultations, you then have to take revised documents with views that have been incorporated from the various, stakeholders and so forth and so on. And then, in terms of the input that we received, because of the diverse nature of the stakeholders, you get input that may be, let me say, competing, input, because the views are different depending on the categories of stakeholders. For instance, in the case of mitigation, in our case, we received varying views in which some feel strongly that the proposed target, was fine, while some other entities felt strongly that the target is not fine. And what target am I referring to? What we had proposed to the audience was a target which had 510 megatons of carbon dioxide, equivalent, emissions by carbon dioxide equivalent by 2025. Then by 2030, we had projected 440. And that range has a lower bound in which you have 398 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, both in 2025 and 2030. So diverse views, unfolded in that regard. For instance, you would get views from the hard to abate sectors who would cautiously, accept that original target. Views that more work needs to be done to demonstrate whether this could actually be achieved or go beyond what is actually being proposed. Concerns were raised regards the extent to which this would put pressure on jobs, impacts especially on those sectors which actions is expected, like coal mining, for instance, amongst others, and related value chains. So we need to be cognizant of some of these, sectors in the process. As you can see, that's the diverse, array of views from different, that we need to accommodate. When it comes to adaptation, there were some views on adaptation, but not as contentious, as the case was in the instance of mitigation. Because in adaptation, we sought to articulate our adaptation communication, which is integrated, within the NDC itself. From negotiations, we had an option to either submit adaptation communication independently, but as South Africa, we put a proposal to the South Africans and sectors that how if we can have the adaptation communication incorporated into the NDC. There was not much, contestation in that regard, except that there were issues that related to other aspects as they relate to the costing for adaptation, which we have sent back to our researchers to relook into that. Issues such as the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, that it's not sufficiently represented at an adequate level of detail. Now this point talks to the fact that some stakeholders would expect, more of a detailed, document in terms of the NDC. But in our case, we know that we are banking on the fact that there's a technical report that drills further on the deeper detail across sectors on this. The NDC itself is primarily intended to be submitted internationally for purposes of indicating, our priorities. But the backup documents that have been researched by the entities that I alluded to earlier will serve to provide, the detail in that regard. Connection issues between adaptation and mitigation are some of the views, that were raised. There were also views of saying that how about regional efforts that may be needed for some adaptation goals, such that, water issues could be addressed and so forth and so on. But we do know that primarily the NDC is a domestic document. We don't have much leeway. Yes, we may be able to synthesize perhaps at another level, but we do not have much leeway to incorporate aspects that are outside necessarily of our borders, because it's an NDC, and by its definition, it has to be nationally determined. Then one other point I am not capturing in this slide is the fact in this PowerPoint presentation is the fact that we also invited, a window was open for written representations, and we received about over 30 proposals from across different sectors. And that kind of input, we had to synthesize and lift up, the key, areas of divergence and areas of convergence from amongst parties. But generally, you would always be having some different views between NGO sectors and business, but also private sector to some extent. So it's important, therefore, that you do your best, to come up with some kind of some mechanism, either by workshopping to better understand particular interest groups and try and explain to them where you indicate that their interests may not necessarily be compromised, or you will try and arrive at some kind of a middle ground. Now, I think I'm left with about 5 minutes. In the 5 minutes that I'm left with, let me just touch briefly on the implementation, thinking. When it comes to implementation in terms of climate policy, South Africa has been following the approach of mainstreaming of climate change into various policies at sectoral level, but also across different spheres of government. So policies to encourage either industries and so forth to integrate and mainstream climate change considerations into their policies have been, is that which has been encouraged. And we believe that when it comes to financing, that should serve as some reasonable ground to be able to lift up, some areas where investments for financing purposes can be, picked up. But also you also have your green infrastructure investments. So when we get into implementation mode at a higher speed, it will be important that such initiatives that are led at a higher political level, for instance, we have green infrastructure investments, programs at president's level. So it's upon us to say to what extent are we making sure that we leverage, on such strategic, programs. Again, when it comes to stimulus packages, including green, stimulus packages in countries, because the economies generally are at their lowest in many, countries the world over. So to what extent do countries do their best to leverage, through such packages as green stimulus packages? The other dimension on implementation relates to the requisite, capacity that such capacities be enhanced across different areas, across different spheres of government at national, provincial, but also at municipality level becomes key. Then finally, on implementation, it's important that as parties, we know what key sectors are likely to carry in terms of the targets, to be finalized. For instance, the energy sector, in our case, most of our emissions come there, and therefore there may be a necessity that a lot of renewables, programs, are deployed, in that direction. Again, the industry structures, when you look at the export basket, at least of South Africa, you will realize that at industry level, the exports are mostly either minerals, chemicals, mostly unprocessed goods. To what extent are those sectors expected, to transform over time, of course, and how are those going to be incentivized? So when it gets to implementation, those become important. Also sectors such as your transport sectors, how are they going to be incentivized? We do have a green transport, strategy, policy here, which points out at what key primary, activities and initiatives need to be executed at the transport sector level. The waste sector is one of those sectors.
Mr.
And
Seleke?
then,
sorry,
yes.
I realize you're probably not too far from wrapping up, but we are falling behind on the time. I wonder if I could ask you to, perhaps in the Q&A session, if there's an opportunity to bring in some of your final points at that stage.
Okay. No, thanks. Actually, I was on the last point as I was talking on thoughts.
You're welcome to conclude. If it's under a minute, you're welcome to conclude.
Oh, yes. So I was just touching on the key sectors. I touched on 3 points in relation to financing, requisite capacities that may necessitate, support, but also technologies, and then sectors that parties need to be cognizant of, which will carry, the transformation towards, the targets. Thank you so much. This ends here in my case, and indeed I will take the questions during Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We need to catch up a bit on time, so I'm going to hand over directly without any further commentary to Marika Vieger. She's a scenario and policy researcher based at the University of International Cooperation, and she's going to tell us a bit more about Costa Rica's NDC experience.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you for inviting me to share with you this experience of Costa Rica and how we've been enhancing our NDC last year. Also, thank you so much for my colleague Mkatuzi of South Africa for presenting to us this interesting case about South Africa, and for Herman, who will share his case of Rwanda. Let me see if I can start sharing my screen. Okay, please let me know if this went well.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm really excited to have so many people accompanying us today and sharing how we've been in different regions even working on our NDCs. I think it's a really valuable lesson to look across different countries. What I would like to do today is share with you how Costa Rica has been using the anticipation of futures to enhance their NDC and also accelerate change. For me, this is very much a talk about looking at the different assumptions that are behind how we plan for climate change, and also looking around us to see what things might change in our future context, and that could influence if we actually reach our goals. I would like to share with you how Costa Rica used foresight and the anticipation of futures to enhance her NDCs. I would also like to, in the first place, start by explaining why we feel that it's important that that foresight is used for these NDC formulation processes, and where we feel that something is missing in the current guidelines to enhance NDCs, and also present to you what this resulted in for Costa Rica. That's basically a wrap up of my presentation. I understand that I have 15 minutes. Perhaps, Alex, if you could confirm to me if that's still the case?
That's correct.
Okay, good. So maybe just to start with, I think that NDC processes are really an opportunity to catalyze change. We know that NDCs are an international pledge to the community to show how we all intend to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? It's a very formal document where we basically explain how much emissions we intend to reduce, how we intend to do that, and who will be participating, on which sectors we're focusing on. I feel that in the last few years, it's very much been a technical document where we look on the technical aspects of how we intend to reduce emissions, and what that will result in terms of numbers. But we also feel that NDCs are not only about a commitment, they're also very much an opportunity to catalyze change under all these different sectors and stakeholders that are participating in this process. And that's also the reason why the international community very much stimulates that different people participate in this process. And we know that, but I would also like to explain to you a different reason why I feel that that's important. One of my main points is that we feel that this process should not only focus on the technical aspects of adaptation and mitigation, but also very much use this moment to include these people in imagining how each of our countries could and should change to be able to reach those goals. And basically doing this by anticipating what the future might look like, and not only looking at what we think it will look like, but also anticipate what other things might change in our environment that could influence if we reach these goals, but that could also help us reach these goals. So in my research, I work as a scenarios and policies researcher in Latin America, supporting different countries in the development of their long-term climate change planning by anticipating futures, by creating in a participatory way future scenarios, and then using those scenarios to support policy making. And what I've been seeing in the last few years, working specifically with NDCs, is that I feel that there is very much something missing in these current guidelines that that countries have to work on these climate goals. So especially in 2015, we were all starting to do this for the first time, and countries really needed something to hold on to and understand how we're supposed to do this, right? So where we are now in 2021 is that from the international community, there's a very big pressure to enhance our climate goals and increase ambitions. And what we also see is that there is a very need for drastic transformation to actually reach these international goals, and avoid these drastic catastrophes that we're already starting to see now. The thing is that currently the focus within these guidelines is very much on quantitative emission abatement calculations of the current policies that exist to reduce emissions. So very much a focus on numbers and on technical ways to calculate how much emissions we will reduce on the one hand, but also very much focusing on what we are now planning to do to reduce emissions, and not necessarily taking into account that there are other technologies that we're not yet using or aware of, and not necessarily taking into account that many things can change, and not only within our countries. So many things can change in terms of the technologies that are available, but also on a socioeconomic scale, the politics of our countries can change, the lifestyles of people living in our countries can change, outside of our of where we live and outside even of our regions. A lot of things are changing, and in such a drastic and rapid way that there are a lot of things that that we do not know yet how they will take place, and that can very much influence our ability of reaching these goals. So we think it is important to include this anticipation of disruption, or anticipating how the future might look like in these NDC processes. Another reason to do that is because we feel that countries, to be able to set these ambitious goals, countries also need to have some sort of security to do that. So how sure can you be to set these ambitious goals when you really know so little about the future, and when a lot of things can go wrong? And when we anticipate what the future might look like, so when we explore possible futures, we know a little bit more about it, and that gives us more security of being able to set these ambitious goals. So what I feel is complicated of this dominant focus on quantitative modeling of greenhouse gas emissions is that countries in development do not necessarily have the same capacities to work with all these different models that exist. We very much realize that it's necessary, because in the end, an NDC is a document where we state how much emissions we will reduce and how we will do that. So you need to make these calculations, but not necessarily we all have the same capacities to do that. But also our research in Central America has shown, and also in 4 other regions in the world that we've been doing the last 2 years in our project Reimagine, together with the CGR research program in agriculture, food security, and climate change, is that countries in development do not necessarily have the data to run these models. So there's an issue of actually data availability, right? Organizations that not necessarily can gather all this information. We also have an issue with then actually, if this information exists, that different institutions can access and use that information. And we also see that there's a trust issue in terms of, if data exists, is that actually the real data? Is it complete enough? So data is really an issue in some regions. And what we've also seen is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that when these conditions or data and capacities exist, we do not necessarily have collaborations between the different institutions, both public and private, to be able to use that and to run these models. So that is why it's also necessary to look at other methods that we can use to enhance NDCs. So we really feel that the anticipation of futures is a necessary innovation to be able to increase these NDC goals. And I noticed that my colleague also mentioned, talking about South Africa, the necessity of testing our assumptions, right? On just looking at what are we assuming here? What kind of conditions do we assume that our country will have, or a region will have, to be able to reach these climate goals? What is that actually based on? And will those conditions actually be there in the next few years? What things might change? Or how we like to say it, how vulnerable are these assumptions? Should we think about backup plans in case the measures that we are intending to implement actually don't work? So that's anticipating the future is all about checking if those assumptions are really correct, right? And doing that continuously and adapting our plans to those possible futures that might come. Another aspect that I think is important is that when we do use foresight to support our climate change planning on the long term, so in a quantitative way or in a qualitative way, basically just basically just anticipating futures. Very often that's still done by a small group of experts. So consultants that know very much about foresight and about modeling. But the thing is that much more people need to participate in these processes. So, and the reason why, and this is really something I'm super passionate about, is that when we, together with all these different stakeholders from a country, from the public sector, but also from the private sector, people of different ages, not only people that are very technical in agriculture or in forestry or in biology or in transport, but also about people that know about society. When we include all these people in thinking about the future, we use that knowledge to change things in the present. So when we know that things might change in the future, we start acting differently now. And when all these people are together in that process, they also influence each other. So I always suggest to have a few stakeholders in a group that are already doing things radically different. So if we have champions in a country that have within agriculture or within transport are doing things very, very differently, then include those in the conversation, because they can also really pollinize other people in that conversation and show them that things can be done differently, right? So we need to move from this expert focus to a more collective process of how are we intending to adapt to and mitigate climate change. And in the future, will that still work, how we're planning on doing it now, and what things might change and what things should we start doing differently now. So this is where I come to the part where I show how Costa Rica has been doing this. And just maybe to mention that we started using this futures approach in 2015. We've really been the last few years. And what I'm presenting to you here is really only this one of the ways that you could do this, but there are many other ways in which you can use foresight to develop an NDC. So in 2020, just like all of you, we were in the middle of the pandemic here. So we had to do this entire process online. That was, in a way, that was actually an advantage because much more people were able to participate. We had about 29 different workshops with more than 350 people from all these different NDC sectors. What we did to organize ourselves a little bit was cluster these sectors in 5 different clusters, basically looking at which sectors had complementarity between each other. So the first cluster was, we were looking at agriculture and forestry and livestock and water. In the second sector, we looked at waste management and construction and industry. In the third sector, we looked at urban development and transport. The fourth sector, we focused on energy, recognizing that there's a lot of relationship between energy and transport. And the last sector was mainly focused on territorial development and planning. So what we wanted is not only include government function people working really technically on NDCs, but also stakeholders from the private sector, stakeholders from academia or NGOs and civil society that actually know a lot about what's going on in each of these sectors and all the new things that are happening and that should be included in in planning for adaptation or mitigation. We also very much made sure that all different age groups were involved, and especially young people very much had a positive influence on the whole process, as different kind of questions and really showed us that they're very much motivated to make and implement all these changes. Okay, so just a little bit of the process. And to show you quickly what this was based on. So as I mentioned, this whole process was basically designed around what we call assumption-based planning, or sometimes we also call it robust decision-making. This is a methodology that was developed by the RAND Corporation many years ago, but that has been developing over the few years. It's basically a general methodological framework where we can integrate both quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches. And as you can see, we use both of them. So in the first place, we used computer modeling to analyze and to calculate the cost and benefits of decarbonization, and also of not only looking at adaptation as in decarbonization, but also looking very much at adaptation and nature-based solutions. And in the second part, we use this participatory scenario development process to basically test and robust the climate plans and policies that were part of these NDC that altogether would pack up to come to this NDC goals. And these two, since these two things mainly took place online, we had a last section where we complemented these with this online process with open consultation to people that were not able to participate in the virtual process, mainly looking at elderly people, indigenous people, but also the LGBTQ community, simply to have more small scale moments to talk to them one-on-one. Yeah, okay. So just to have this overview, and I'll go into detail about each of these aspects. Okay, so just maybe quickly, and I won't go into detail about this, but I will leave you the links if you would like to have more information about each of these processes. In the first place,
Marika, I was just about to say, yeah, if you could wrap up in about a minute or so, that would help us.
Okay, I'll do it very quickly. So in the first place, we had a team of the university doing computer modeling to look at the costs and benefits of decarbonization. So basically, really looking at what implications will our current policies have, and what implications will it have if these outcomes actually change. So if our plan is now based on reducing emissions in livestock, then what outcomes will that have, and how will these outcomes change if we change, for example, the livestock feed, or if we have a plant-based diet, just simply to show you that we don't only want to look at what we're planning on doing now, but if this changes, then what might that look like? And the second approach was very much this participatory process, in which basically stories of the future were developed based on drivers of change. So drivers in our context, national or regional or global context, that might change to help us anticipate what the futures of Costa Rica might look like, and then use all these different scenarios to literally test what the climate measures that we're planning on having now for these different sectors, what impact they might have, and if they would not work, then how would they need to be improved to have a more robust and sustainable impact on the long term. I have so many slides, but I'm going to just skip a few. Okay, I think this is maybe the most important thing. As I mentioned before, the NDC and climate policies are all based on assumptions. So when we look at future scenarios, we basically test if the assumptions that we have about the future will change, what things in the environment might change that might influence the possibility of success of our plans. And then especially look at if things will change, then how should we adapt our climate measures of the things that we're planning on doing to adapt or mitigate to be able to reach our goals. That's the main point that I want to make. Yeah, so maybe just to wrap it up, we feel that the anticipation and imagination of possible futures is a necessary innovation to be able to increase NDC ambition. It's basically looking at shifting from not only looking at climate change in terms of numbers, but also looking at anticipating how the society could, but also must change. We feel that this can really help imagine this transformative development that we need, and especially when different stakeholders participate in this process, that can set in motion the climate action that is needed. We feel that it's a possible alternative for countries that have different capacities and conditions to define climate goals and basically develop contingency plans in case things change. And an important aspect is that foresight and future scenarios can help countries deal with uncertainties and increase their confidence to define and achieve ambitious goals. I will leave you with these links in case you want to look up more information. I'll share this presentation with the organizers so they can send it to you by email, and in case you would like to contact me. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and apologies for rushing you, but of course we do want to make sure that there is at least some time to respond to the questions that are already starting to appear in the chat. I see there's one or two directed to you, Marika, so you can maybe have a look at that in the meantime. Yep. But now directly over to Mr. Herman Kuzimana, Director of Climate Change and International Obligations Unit and the Rwanda Environment Management Authority for Rwanda's Ministry of Environment. Mr. Kuzimana, could you just confirm that you're getting us on audio?
Yes. Thank you very much, moderator, for giving me the floor. Can you hear me very well?
I can hear you. I'd also warn you that I'm also going to have to be quite strict on time. Otherwise, we're not going to have time to respond to the questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. As you mentioned, I want to share the experience of Rwanda about linking NDC with existing low carbon development policies. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's come up.
Yes.
If you can put it on presentation mode.
Okay, okay.
If that's going to cost us too much time, you could work with a screen, maybe just zoom in a little.
Yes, I made.
Alex, Mr. Herman is muted.
Yes, no, I'm aware. I take it he was just taking a second to try to get the slide up.
I've asked him to unmute.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yes.
We can hear you.
And you can see my presentation?
No, it's not sharing at the moment. Mr. Hakuzimana, I do think that if we're not able to get the presentation up, it does seem to be coming up. Yes, so it's still not in presentation mode, but I don't think we should lose more time on this. You can just work through the slides.
Yes. Thank you very much again, and apologies for the inconvenience. I will try to be brief. As I mentioned, I wanted to share the experience of Rwanda, how our NDC development was, our NDC process also referred to the existing low carbon development policies. Just this as outline, I would give the brief on the background of Rwanda NDC and talk about the Rwanda Green Growth and the Climate Resilience Strategy, which is considered as the country's long-term low carbon development strategy. And then I try to show the link. This is the background of NDCs in general, and I don't think I have to spend too much of the time on this. Just to mention that the main difference of Rwanda's revised NDCs, NDC with the previous one that we had submitted in 2015, is that the revised one, the quantification of emission targets and the costs were done, while in the previous one it was only it was like action based and no emissions were quantified in the figures, and also the funding requirements were not well estimated, which is different from the revised one. And regarding the emission targets, the revised NDC, Rwanda revised NDC targets to reduce at 30–80% of emission by 2030, compared to the projection based on a business as usual scenario. Here are some of the targeted emission reductions per sectors. As you can see, on the right corner, those are the emissions that we are intending to reduce. With and as Romy mentioned, Rwanda NDC considered the conditional and unconditional measures, and with conditional unconditional measures, we intend to reduce up to 16% of emission using our domestic means, while with conditional measures we reduce up to 38%. The main targeted sectors are energy, transport, buildings, agriculture, and waste management for the mitigation options, and integrated water resources management, agriculture, land use and forestry, human settlement, health, transport, mining, and disaster management for adaptation interventions. Regarding the funding requirements, Rwanda, it was estimated that to implement the Rwanda NDC will require 11 billion up to 2030, and 5.3 billion are dedicated for adaptation, while 5.7 billion are dedicated for mitigation options highlighted in Rwanda NDC. Again, those measures were divided into, as I mentioned, even the cost was done for conditional measures and unconditional measures. Just to remind that unconditional measures are those which will be implemented using the domestic means without requiring the external finance. While the conditional ones would require the external finance and the RS. They are estimated at 60% of funding requirements. Here is the chart showing the funding requirements for adaptation, which will cost around 5.3 billion. And the most part will be channeled to interventions in agriculture, up to 57%, and the main measures in agriculture related to irrigation, improved water management, and sustainable land management practices. While the large share in mitigation will be channeled to transport, low carbon building, and electricity generation. Yeah. Regarding the Rwanda Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy that we consider as the country long-term low carbon development strategy, it was developed in 2011 with a vision for Rwanda to be a developed climate resilience and low carbon economy by 2050. And it has 5 main guiding principles, including economic growth and poverty reduction, sustainability of environment and natural resources, welfare and wellness of citizens in a growing population, good regional and global citizenship, and gender equality and equity. And it has 14 program of action, which really informed also the actions that we committed in NDC. Here are those program of action, and what I can say is that this green growth and climate resilience strategy that Rwanda has already developed before NDCs, it is the one which used to inform also the sector strategic plans on which Rwanda NDC was built on to ensure that the actions that we commit will be implemented. Otherwise, if in development process of NDC, if you commit the actions which are not in the plans of sectors, it will be difficult to implement. Yes, as I was mentioning, Rwanda NDC was not developed from nowhere. It draws upon the previous strategic document on climate change, mainly this green growth and climate resilience strategy, which provide the guidance to sectors on how to develop, but also considering the low carbon and the climate resilience development. To achieve this goal, to be climate resilient and low carbon economy by 2050. And the nine associated sector working papers of this green growth and climate resilience strategy were the ones where the actions, both mitigation and adaptation, that were summarized in Rwanda NDC were fetched from. And those are those sector working papers which formed Rwanda NDCs are mainly the one for transport, energy, agriculture, forest, land, city and built environment, water, and mining and finance. Not only the green growth and the climate resilience strategy informed the development of Rwanda NDCs, but also it referred also to other strategic documents which were developed by different sectors in the country, including strategic program for climate resilience, which was developed in 2017, which informed a lot the component of adaptation in NDCs, the forest investment program, which mostly informed adaptation, but also mitigation. And it also referred to some studies which were conducted, like those climate vulnerability index assessments report, which were produced in 2015 and 18. All those documents were consulted, and together with sector experts, we put together the measures to pick and compile in NDCs. This was to make sure that they are not to make sure that sectors are well involved and actions to commit will be implemented. Of course, not all actions, but main actions were fetched from all those existing sector strategic plans. As conclusion, NDCs should not be taken as strong standalone plans. In the development process of NDCs, countries should sit and see what they had already in their plans. And for those who have those long-term low carbon strategies, development strategies, there are good sources to inform NDC development process. And what to do is to downscale and pick the measures which will be implemented, considering the timeline for NDCs, and also to ensure a smooth implementation. NDC should not be imposed to sectors. All sectors should participate and give the options or the measures that they will contribute to. I hope I didn't take too much of time. Maybe if there are some other clarification, we will discuss when we will open the floor. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've got about just under 25 minutes to address some of the questions. So we'll first go through some that have been raised in the chat. I would also say at this point, just in case some of our participants do drop off in the final minutes of the session, that There is a written output that is also tied to some of the research that Romy has done, as well as the presentations we've heard today. So just to address the question of where does the content that we're discussing go, what process does it feed into, that will be captured in a publicly accessible document, disseminated to our stakeholder, and would also inform our engagement with key climate stakeholders, as I've said, at national, regional level, and engagement in various policy processes. So with that being said, let's quickly get to some of these questions. And we'll start, there was a question specifically around, to Marika, around the consultations and to what extent it's integrated indigenous knowledge and local knowledge. And a linked question that speaks, asked to just elaborate a little bit about those workshops in the context of constraints related to COVID, and how confident you are that those are representative views. I'm going to run through a few, so let's all think about those. I would also say that our South African and Rwandan speaker, if there are specific comments about how you address these issues, you're welcome to also respond to those questions from the national perspective. And then this question, maybe remarking on the South African presentation, is I think to many of us here in this sort of forum, the argument is, of course, that there's not a trade-off between economic growth and innovation and climate action. Indeed, through climate action, we create opportunities in the green economy for innovation, new systems, new competitiveness, and new green jobs. But that sort of narrative is not always accepted with the stakeholders we engage in. So I think the comment essentially asked to elaborate a little bit, perhaps in the South African context, how that's seen and how that was managed in the NDC process. There's a question about using foresight methods at the company level. I don't think we need to go in great length into that. Obviously, these technologies or these methodologies can be applied at international, national, company, broader stakeholder groups. Indeed, SAI itself is also engaged in these sorts of exercises, and there's some material available on that. And then, Romy, if you want to elaborate on the question that you've answered essentially already in the Q&A, you're welcome to do that. And then there was also a question to you around the reference to South Africa, Nigeria, and China seem to have strong NDCs. Kind of what's behind that kind of assessment from your side. I'm going to stop there because it's going to become too much. Let's see how we go for time. Rica, I'd welcome you to start, and then I would invite the other speakers again. As I said, you're also welcome to speak to the questions that were addressed specifically to Marika from your national perspectives.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. And thank you for your questions. Indeed, indigenous knowledge is very much relevant to be included in these kind of processes, especially when planning for climate change, thinking about adaptation. In Costa Rica, we are very much aware of the fact that it would not be so easy for indigenous people to participate in a virtual process. So we made sure that there were offline moments, so face-to-face meetings with the different indigenous groups that we have in Costa Rica, to have them and discuss with them the ideas that the country has for adaptation and mitigation, but also their ideas on doing that. Costa Rica has a very strong focus on nature-based solutions, and we're also very much, the NDC team was very much aware that their knowledge is needed to use this focus. So just to give a comment on that. And in terms of involving local communities, what the NDC team did was make sure that they were represented through the different grassroots organizations and municipalities and NGOs that participated in the process. And I think it's also worthwhile to mention that Costa Rica has a whole process apart from the NDC, that they are working with municipalities and through them with local communities to plan for and take action on climate change at the regional and subnational level. And yes, indeed, Foresight can be used on a company level very, very much. Yeah. And yeah, so I think that's it for me. Thank you. I hope that helped.
Nkatazi, any comments from you?
Oh, thanks, Alex.
Sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
Nkatazi. There was also just a question about what the current status is of South Africa's NDC. Has it been presented to the cabinet? So you could just fill us in on that as well.
Oh, thanks, I've noted that. Perhaps let me start with that one, I think by Karen. Yeah, the status of our NDC currently, we are just at the final stages of taking the revised, documents to cabinet. The timelines for that process are over the next 2 or 3 weeks to finalization. So what you are having and you may be talking to is not as yet finalized. That will be finalized, at cabinet. We've just incorporated inputs, revised, and put it through, the system. Then the question with regards to indigenous knowledge and local knowledge and constraints of COVID. Let me lean more on the COVID constraints in our case. The approach we followed, like I indicated when we presented, is that we encouraged a system, a hybrid, approach in which we could make use of the platforms such as your Zoom, your Teams, for some participants to be able to interface virtually. At the same time, we were there physically across all 9 provinces and with specific interest groups to engage and explain, the thinking underlying the NDC, the targets and how the proposed targets, were arrived at and so forth. Then with regards to the question that the colleague, I think it's Kaole Muneng, I think you've covered that one, that it's more of a sustainability question here, because you cannot just grow whilst you perpetually, make use of fossil fuels and all of that. Because again, there are other negative externalities in that regard, in which people's health, may be compromised, in which other resources may be negatively infected, including water and various, other resources. So it's a case of how do you make use. In one other slide, I indicated here that the setting for the NDC is such that it should enable us to contribute towards growth, to enable us to recover from the low growth that we are currently, experiencing. There are other, factors outside of our economy, like for instance, your carbon border adjustments, which are pressures from without, that have implications for the likely transitions that way. But primarily, we have commitments of our own that we need to satisfy. Let me leave it at that, Kaole. But it's not a case of growth, irrespective, of whatever else, that happens. It's a sustainability, question. Grow, but grow in a manner that is more sustainable, in which, other sectors and other, sections of the economy will be able to be, sustained as well. Then the third one, I think it relates to the question that Tomani had raised, the inclusion of adaptation in the NDC, which he or she acknowledges as a step in the right direction, and further raises the issue of international waters, and asking as to The question I made in that regard, Tomani, in the question that you are putting, this is one of the inputs that we received from the stakeholders, wherein stakeholders indicated that let us have a consideration of that, where we have water, relations with other countries, including in the SADC region, that should be included in the NDC. But the principle that we are trying to balance in that regard is to say that the NDC is nationally determined, and it is not that easy, as you are putting the question to me as to how do I see this being captured. I do not have a specific answer in that regard, but my initial thinking is that there may be an instrument outside of the NDC, wherein if there are two countries that are cooperating, then the water resources, management and all of that is being dealt with through that bilateral, kind of an instrument between those two countries. The NDC itself may not necessarily be able to fully satisfy that. And at this stage, I do not have an idea in terms of how it may be captured if it ends up being captured in the final document. Let me take a pause there, Alex, unless otherwise there's an additional question that I may have left out. Thank you.
No, I think that's fine for now. And now invite Mr. Hakuzimana if you have comments, and then we'll go on to Romy.
Thank you very much, Alex. Maybe I can comment on inclusion of adaptation in NDC. NDC as it's nationally determined, and again, it is considered as national climate action plan for countries, and especially for developing countries where adaptation is a priority. I think it's very important to include adaptation in their NDCs to guide even their adaptation efforts. It's very useful. Regarding the challenge of COVID-19, what I can say is that COVID-19 affected each sector and our activities, and luckily for Rwanda, the revision of NDC has already started in 2019, and the COVID-19 lockdown came in March 2020 when we were finalizing the process, but we had some difficulties to gather stakeholders to validate the last reports. Fortunately, they were reviewed before the lockdown, and the virtual meeting were used to finalize the documents. And it didn't affect too much the Rwanda process, because we submitted our NDC to BNF process in May 2020. Thank you.
Shall we go on to Romy? Are you finished with your remarks, Mr. Kuzimana?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, the audio wasn't so good in those final seconds. Romy?
I just wanted to pick up on the ranking. There was a question about how I phrased earlier in my presentation that countries had shown intentions, countries that hadn't necessarily submitted, but they'd shown intention for stronger contributions, and how we rank those countries. How do we say what is stronger and what is more enhanced? And essentially, there was quite a lot of contributions in the chat, but my specific presentation was just referring to the Climate Action Tracker, which does a job of looking at countries globally and putting into sections who's obviously submitted, whether they feel on their analysis whether the contributions are stronger. And Essentially, I think this is done. They do have a whole methodological section which breaks down why and how they can say a country has stronger or more ambitious commitments. And obviously, I think they look at they do a comparison between the first NDC, the 2015 NDC, and then the revised NDC, and they compare targets, quantity goals in terms of GHG reductions, what a country has achieved to date, and they look at the trajectories and whether this is aligned with what they've committed to, and whether it's aligned with the Paris Agreement goal. And then there's a whole pile of ranking systems that they use to say, is this fair? And it's about historical emissions, it's about current emissions, it's about vulnerability, it's about developing country status, it's about many things, but essentially they look at the carbon budget and the contributions to see whether they're fair, equitable, representative, transparent, comprehensive, etc. And then they do a ranking. But it's just one tool. I mean, other people were saying that the climate equity, there's a climate equity reference. The UNDP and the World Resources Institute have also come through with quality assurance indexes, all to kind of assist with the the enhanced ambition of these countries. But again, I mean, they all have different systems and approaches. But yeah, I'll stop there. I think it's just looking at whether what countries have said they're going to do, are they actually doing it, and is this in line with the global commitments that are necessary. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. I would just remind everyone that there is a link, and I'll just post it now in the chat, for an online evaluation form for the event. It would really help us if you would take a second to fill that out. We've only got a few minutes left. I did see there was a comment or a question around gender in terms of the South African NDC, but maybe as a final round, we could just invite comments broadly from the group of the speakers on how they've seen gender issues being discussed and hopefully incorporated in NDC processes. We could also include, if there are some specific comments around youth as a particular vulnerable group. We could, I don't want to put anyone on the spot. Nkutazi, I see your hand is up, but our other speakers, you're welcome to follow. And then Eric, let's have Nkutazi first and followed by Eric.
Okay, thanks Alex for the opportunity. Yes, the question that Daisy is raising, it's one of the major inputs that we did receive. The one that relates, to gender. And currently we are already working on some gender, program under the gender action plan for the country in terms of how gender considerations are to be incorporated when we carry out implementation. And the NDC itself was not strong enough in terms of articulating gender, aspects, and that input, was received on our side. But we are already getting, support and funding, I think, from UNDP in terms of supporting us on the gender action plan, component. We have a dedicated focal point that will see to it that is incorporated. Then aside from that, without abusing your platform, I think Marike had touched on a very pertinent point of this modeling and the data gaps that exist. In our case, we do have data. We have been writing the biannual update reports, but the point he made is a pertinent point. It is key, especially for developing countries that we are, because in some of our countries, there are some data gaps, and we usually push for the necessary support, to be provided. And also, where modeling is concerned, it's important to be closer to modeling, like I indicated earlier, and influence some of these assumptions, because some of these assumptions are drawn from already existing, policies, like your macroeconomic policies and so forth. You do not want to model something that will constrain, that which may have already been expressed in other policies on the economy side, on the energy side, and so forth and so on. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Eric.
Yeah, so thanks, Alex, and thanks to all our three speakers. I think this has been very useful session with very rich discussions, presentation from the three country cases. Just taking advantage of the few minutes we're still having, I would really want to get a little reactions or comments based on experiences, particularly from Steleki in the South African case, because it looks like the South African case is really comprehensive and wide and deep in terms of getting stakeholders involved, being part of the whole process. Now looking at the wider SADC region and even the wider Africa and other regions, the element looking at the time gaps or time need limitations, but also the question of the capacity of different countries to go that deep, especially because now I think you also touched on it, the element of you are getting a lot of information, a lot of data from all these consultations. How do you balancing all this so that you don't lose any important information that you get, but also getting the real thing that speaks to everybody. So that balance, and I may really want to hear a little more about that from you. For Marieke, thanks so much again for that. Something little for you is, yes, this is the forecasting, the future forecasting that you presented, very interesting. And I know, for example, currently countries are going about, doing their long-term development, strategies. And one of the things that I see, for example, in the case of Kenya, the projections, projecting future, climate and all that. How do you see these two, the model that we presented, the forecasting and, the element of projecting future emissions and all that, and how these two can be balanced to give more, more useful strategies. So that's what I wanted to, maybe if we have time, you can comment on that. Thanks, Alex.
Perfect. Well, we've literally got 2 minutes, so I don't think we'll be able to do those questions justice. But Mariki, Herman, Kutazi, if you want to take just a few seconds to give some final thoughts to those questions or general final remarks.
If I may, thank you so much, Alex. Yes, I just wanted to make a final comment, and I think I also will reply to that last question with that I think a really interesting aspect of Costa Rica's NDC that could be interesting for for African countries, including South African countries, is that it very much focused on creating the conditions to be able to reach adaptation and mitigation goals. So it's not an NDC that only talks about technical aspects of adaptation and mitigation, but very much more on the social economic aspect. And I would like to invite you to look at the NDC and perhaps be inspired by that. It also has a very strong focus on adaptation, which I think is also very relevant for these countries. So I just wanted to mention that. And yes, indeed, a balance between both quantitative and qualitative aspects of a foresight process is really important. We cannot only think about numbers and modeling, but also think about how we have to achieve this and what kind of society we need in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. In a few seconds, any final thoughts, Mr. Kuzimana?
Thank you very much, Alex. What I can say is that for those countries who are still in the process of revising their NDCs, I would advise to revise NDC through consultative process with stakeholders, because from what we saw, it facilitates the buy-in and it ensures that it will be implemented smoothly, because it contains the ideas from various stakeholders, and they put it in their action plans. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much to our co-host, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Thank you so much to our speakers who've made time in very busy schedules to join us today, and for the manner in which you engaged with the questions and in the discussion. It was really a fantastic discussion. I've said it before, I'll just remind everyone, there will be a written output coming out of this exercise. The presentations will be shared with the participants. And if there are follow-ups, you can reach us through our website, and we'd be happy to assist you further. So thank you, everyone. And with that, I'll close the meeting.
Thank you, everybody. Wonderful.
Thank you and bye.
Thanks and goodbye.